I want to talk about making your first pull request. That can be kind of a scary experience, especially if you've never made a pull request before in a production setting, because there's a lot of emotion tied to that. Because on one hand, I think that you think that everybody's going to judge you based on your code, and that everyone's going to remember what your code, originally looked like when you first made that pull request. I think both of those things couldn't be farther from the truth, and I think that the first pull request is just honestly a rite of passage that we all have to face when we start in software engineering as our job, because you have to start somewhere, right? You have to. Everybody's going to make pull requests that break production. It's inevitable because we're human, right? We make mistakes, and it's unavoidable. And it's not that we're trying to, but it's just that we're writing, code, and sometimes we just make a an error. Um, so it's inevitable that we're going to make pull requests that cause bugs. It's also inevitable that we're going to make pull requests that we spent a little bit too much time on in terms of refactoring the subjective things that honestly don't really matter at the end of the day. So we're going to put up pull requests that it took us too long to make the pull request, or we spent too much time kind of laboring over the small things that don't matter. We're going to introduce bugs. We're going to do all that stuff. Everybody has done that one way or another. And your first pull request doesn't need to be perfect. And I think that that's the hard part to accept, is that you don't always have to be pushing perfect code. If you think back to when you're in school, it's impossible to always be submitting perfect papers. The same way is in work, or professional software development. You're not always going to be pushing up these just like these groundbreaking perfect pull requests. It's just not going to happen. And I think that you have to accept that coming into the job, that you're not always going to be perfect. And the first pull request is yeah, it's a little scary, but it's also it's something that you're not even going to remember later on down the road, because it doesn't really matter. It really comes down to what you happen to be working on at the time. If you get an easier task, your pull request might be, pretty straightforward. The code change makes sense, and that's that, and you're done, and you did a good job. But if you get a task that you're assigned to where the problem is very it's vague, or it's kind of like an obscure thing that only sometimes happens, and the code to fix that is really it's not straightforward. Those pull requests are not going to be that those are just a different that those are just different, right? Those require a little bit more thought and consideration from the whole team to make sure they understand what's going in here, rather than just like if you're adding a null check somewhere, if you're like adding a some kind of else condition, or whatever you're doing. Those kind of pull requests are going to be a little more straightforward, and I think that those are going to be more like the pull requests that you're going to get right off the bat, that are really more just geared towards like basic syntax, or just like can you write in the language that you're going to be working in, those kind of things. Now, I would say just don't stress about what the first pull request looks like. Especially don't just don't spend too much time like writing a description, or like writing a perfect commit history, or a title, or anything like that. While details on that are good, make sure that you just don't stress about it, because that's not really what matters. Truthfully, at the end of the day, what matters is that the code going in isn't introducing any bugs, or it's doing what you said it's going to do, or the ticket said it's going to do, I should say. I remember when I first started, I was super stressed out about what my pull requests looked like, because, again, when you come from an internship to working full time, it's just a different dynamic, right? Internships, your responsibility is a little bit more limited in scope, in the sense that you're only there, a finite amount of time, and then you either are going to stay on if you get an offer, or you're going to go elsewhere. So you just the scope of your responsibilities is probably going to be slimmer. I say probably because some places I'm sure have internships that are like basically full time employment, but generally it's going to be a little different than when you start full time. Full time, your pull requests are going to have a little bit more like breath to them, responsibility, and they're going to follow you. The code that you put in, you're not going to be able to leave it. It's always going to be lingering, and you're always going to have to maintain and fix, something that you might have put in code years ago. So I think that changes your approach to how you look at it, right? You want to put code out there that's easily maintainable, straightforward, makes sense, and it's not doing anything overly fancy or complex when it doesn't need to. And when you have that in mind as you approach kind of your first pull request, I think it's important that you keep it simple, right? You just keep it simple and you only do what the ticket has you required to do. Because I think that there's also a bit of a temptation here to go and try to do a bunch of other things to show that you're capable of going beyond what the ticket asks. Like if you have a spot in code where you want to refactor or you want to change the logic to make it a little bit more concise or whatever you do, anything that you do that ventures outside of the scope of what your ticket has written up introduces inherent risk because now you're adding stuff that wasn't specifically defined in the ticket. So I really would try to just stick to exactly what the ticket has and just keep it as simple as possible, especially for your first pull requests as you're just starting out, because you just don't want to try to do too much at the beginning that may cause problems later on. Like if you refactor something and then you introduce a bug, then you have a bug ticket you got to fix, and then it kind of creeps out, into more and more things. Whereas if you just left it in the smallest scope possible that accomplishes the goal, I think that that's important to remember early on, especially when you're just starting out somewhere, because it shows that you're able to get something from the it shows that you're able to pick something up and get it to completion. And honestly, that sometimes is the hardest part because software is a funny thing. Software is not like building Legos. Software is like a kind of a growing, never finished product, right? Sometimes we want to get stuff done, but it's not as clear. It's not as cut and dry as that. We might be 75% of the way done, but the last 25% is like, you know what I mean? It's kind of grows with us because as we put that 75% in, we notice all this other stuff that also has to change, and that 25%, left of the way all of a sudden kicks back to like 30 or 40% because of technical debt that we have to fix. Now it's, creeps into what the scope of this ticket, and it just kind of grows from there. And as we add, more features come in or bugs or whatever you're doing, it all kind of makes the end a little bit blurred. And sometimes achieving that, truly finished status becomes quite difficult. And that's just what happens with software. As much as we don't want it to happen, that's just the nature of this product because it's just like it's like writing a story. It's easy to always go back and make edits and revise and change and add to the story, but sometimes you just have to call it done. And so when you're just starting out, I think it's important to establish what done means for yourself in terms of your tickets in your code, because if you're able to get a good pattern going, you get a good rhythm, and as you're getting more comfortable in the code, you might write up some tickets yourself that you want to then go and do. Like if you truly notice a spot where you want to refactor, I would say that you should probably just write that in another ticket and then do it separately from the scope of your current ticket you're working on. So again, keep it simple and keep it short, right? Like just do the code that it takes to complete the ticket that you have. And I know for me, when I was starting out, right, I wanted to impress the people I was working with because I wanted to make a good first impression, and I wanted to show that I was capable of not only completing the ticket that I had, but also going above and beyond, right, and doing these other things. And looking back on it, it definitely distracted me from like what the main focus of the ticket was. And so I'm really am telling myself this, and I wish that I had kept things more simple and kept things a little bit more like, here's what I'm doing, here's the changes, and then here's what it's going to look like when it's done. And I think back really, at internships and then my first job, I've seen pull requests go a lot of different ways. Pull requests at some places were very kind of like ad hoc, as people like just reviewed them when they had time, or that people gathered around at a central location in the office and actually looked at the code together. Some people do it in online meetings together. Some people just do it on an individual basis. So you're gonna have a wide variety of experiences of how pull requests or code reviews can go. Um, and if you're in an environment where code reviews are very interactive and people are giving you feedback and that sort of thing, try not to take it personally when you receive criticism or feedback about your code, because it's not really intended to discredit you. It's really just intended to hopefully help you become a better software developer. And code reviews, we've talked about this on the channel before. Sometimes it's hard to be receptive to criticism to our code because it's something we wrote, right? We take hopefully we take pride in whatever we're making. So sometimes that can be it's hard to sometimes be receptive to criticism, especially when we view the criticism as a bit subjective in terms of our code, right? If it really is a subjective criticism, like if it's a critique about whether or not you should use curly braces you know or using whatever it is, those can be a little bit harder to grapple with, especially when there's not really a clear defined style guide for the team. I would say if there is a style guide, try to adhere as closely as you can to whatever style your team chooses. But if there's not really a style guide, and then you're getting a lot of subjective criticism, I think that warrants a discussion amongst the whole team to create what the style of code that your team should be writing. Not that truthfully, I'm just gonna say, like, I don't really think that there should be style guides. Truthfully, I really don't, because I think that code, a lot of it is subjective in nature, right? Like, yeah, obviously the core functionality of like what you're programming, there's more or less right and wrong ways to do things sometimes. And obviously, like, yeah, okay, yeah, if you're doing something with like, I don't, let's think of an example like database connections, right? There's a more clear path to do that. Or if you're working with on the channel, maybe mass transit and RabbitMQ, there's configuration stuff that you have to make sure you get right. I'm not talking about those kind of code things. I'm talking about like just truly personal style or personal touches to the code you're writing. And so I think if you're in an environment where you're experiencing a lot of subjective criticism on your code, I really think that again warrants a whole team discussion about it. And I would say that are if you're nervous about bringing that up or pushing back on it, especially if you are just starting out as a software developer one, I definitely would not be. I would try to push back on that for sure, because I think that shows that you're confident about what you're writing and you actually want to get better. Because if you don't say anything, it might look like you just don't care. At least that's how I would kind of take it. But some people might take it differently. Um, it really depends. It really depends how what kind of the kind of vibe on your team. Honestly, I would hope that teams are open to whatever style people have, as long as they kind of, again, as long as it makes a little bit of sense. That's kind of how I take it. But again, it's software is a funny thing, right? It really is. You can see a wide variety of styles. You can see some styles that look like they just came out of an early 2000s object oriented book, that are just straight by the book. There's no deviation from anything, and you're writing code exactly like this. Now, then you might see styles that look like somebody just came from the newest JavaScript framework and they came into .NET and did all those things. And so I think it's a healthy blend of both. And I think that we need to create an environment where we're open to allowing styles to kind of show through and really be open to creative new ideas, because I think that that's where the power of programming really comes through, because you're able to think through new solutions to problems, um, and honestly just think about new ways of doing things. And it's hard to implement that personally, especially when you're if your team is not on board for that. Um, and if your team is not on board, really, just for open conversations or open dialogue about styles, I really would push on somebody to try to get those conversations started, because I think that, you know, it's hard because job satisfaction does not reduce down to just how well you're doing, at your job. Job satisfaction, I mean, it's obvious. I mean, a lot of it comes down to how people are appreciated and how people feel about the work in general, like the overall environment. And I think that if we're all a little bit more comfortable in an environment where we can talk about whatever it is we want to talk about in the code and new ideas and share things, I really think that that creates an environment where people are more willing to contribute to making the product better, because people are now excited about it because they can bring in their own personal styles and touches into what they're making. So honestly, I would say that if you're just starting out, I would really look for ways where you can show what you're thinking. If you have to set up a meeting and you want to talk through something you're learning on the side, or a topic that you've been learning about, and you just want to have an audience where you can share it and maybe bounce ideas off of. If you want to start a book club at work, if you want to go make a presentation about a personal project, I would do all that stuff, because that not only shows you have an interest in what you're doing, but it also, you never know what that may spark in somebody else. Like if they're interested in some like obscure topic that you happen to be reading about, that creates a connection where you can then maybe make something that incorporates that technology in the future. Because I mean, truthfully, you never know when something you learned is going to be a solution in the future. You just never know. I've had like I've read something a year ago and then it just kind of pops up and you're like, oh, like I remember reading about that, so now I can implement it here. It's really crazy how that works, right? You can never plan 100% like when you'll use what you learn, but just having that in the back of your mind, I think is super powerful. And so I think that, again, starting out, I wish I did a better job at doing this. And I'm trying to improve at it, and I'm trying to be more open to, I guess sharing what I'm learning and what topics I find interesting at the time. But again, if you're just starting out, don't stress about the first pull request. Do the best you can, but keep the conversations open with people, um, and talk about the code and the system, and make sure that you are asking questions and trying to be curious about the system that you're working in. And if you have suggestions for what you want to do, put it in a ticket or a document and keep a log of that. And as you go and you share those with people, you never know what may happen. I'll see you in the next one.